On Florida's west coast in the beautiful Tampa Bay area, a very special neighborhood is tucked in between Tampa's growing downtown and the expansive waterfront known as Hillsborough Bay. Often considered home to one of the grandest collections of historically preserved bungalows in the country, the story of Tampa's Hyde Park is in many ways the story of the development of Florida's west coast. Welcome on this journey. This is a story of early Tampa, Hyde Park, and the significant role the bungalow had on the neighborhood. In 1880, with a population of 720, Tampa was little more than a collection of scattered settlements in what is today's downtown. It was an open frontier, with most of Tampa's settlers involved in fishing, farming, limited water commerce, and the protection of Tampa Bay at Fort Brooke. Steamships and fishing vessels occasionally visited. Land travel to Tampa at the time was difficult, but change was just around the corner. And with the arrival of Henry B. Plant and his railroad in 1883, Tampa was on the way. Early 1884 marked Tampa's link by rail to Jacksonville, and suddenly Tampa became accessible to the northeastern United States and points west. Mr. Plant also owned a steamship line and numerous real estate investments. His vision of linking freight and passengers from ship to rail and vice versa now extended Tampa's reach to Havana, New Orleans, Key West, and Mobile. In 1885, Tampa's first streetcar line was launched, and the purchase by successful businessman Don Vincent Martinez Ybor of the land known today as Ybor City began a period of dramatic construction and expansion. Investors followed, and by 1886, Ybor City was annexed into Tampa. Soon, immigrants were arriving from Cuba, Spain, southern Italy, and beyond. 1886 also marked the arrival of O.H. Platt from Hyde Park, Illinois. His purchase of 20 acres west of the Hillsborough River marked the official establishment of the area known as Hyde Park. That same year, Henry B. Plant purchased 40 acres north of the newly subdivided Hyde Park, with the intent of building the grandest hotel in the world. New York architect J.A. Wood was commissioned to make the hotel magnificent. The hotel he created epitomized the romantic era of American design and satisfied Plant's desire for a one-of-a-kind architectural marvel. Soon, Hyde Park became the most desirable address in Tampa, and fashionable private homes graced the growing district. Orange groves dominated the western sections of Hyde Park at the end of the 19th century, especially the area south of Swan Avenue. But by 1910, the groves that extended to the bay had given way to newly subdivided residential tracts. The vision of a beautiful roadway along Hillsborough Bay that would ensure access to all of Tampa and Hyde Park came to fruition in 1907. When prominent Hyde Park land developers started filling in the mudflats along the water's edge. Although building activity had been underway for several years, it was the completion of Bayshore Boulevard that enabled the further expansion of Hyde Park. With economic growth and social change underway in Tampa and across the country, a fresh, new, less formal type of housing emerged to meet 20th century America's growing middle class.
The bungalow was a great step forward. The nation and the world was experiencing great changes, so the bungalow sort of fit in very, very nicely. What great changes? Well, women's suffrage, for instance, the automobile, the airplane. The world was changing, and the bungalow became the darling of the American public because it reflected the mood and the sense of the beginning of the 20th century.
The idea of house patterns, popular in the 1800s, took on a new significance, and with the emergence of mail-order catalogs, the modest bungalow became the aspiration of many working Americans.
These were basically prefabricated houses. They were purchased out of catalogs. So you went and you purchased a home. It was then sent to the nearest point of your location via rail, boxed in a boxcar, and then you hired a carpenter. And they took these ready-made pieces and assembled the houses according to the plans.
The word bungalow quickly became the American parlance for an achievable and comfortable style of living, as lovingly described in Sunset magazine back in 1913. When you see a cozy one-story dwelling with low-pitched roof and very wide eaves, lots of windows, and an outside chimney of cobble, half hidden by clinging vines, that is a bungalow. A type of small house, borrowed from the 19th century British term for a one-story house in India with an encircling veranda and tile or thatched roof, the American bungalow reflects the evolution that was necessary to satisfy the changes that were occurring in the United States at the turn of the century. Modest and welcoming, the bungalow's wide-open front porches are turned outward to adjacent neighbors. Open floor plans incorporate the use of inexpensive materials and clean lines that create harmony with the landscape. The bungalow borrowed the architectural styles that dominated American houses built in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, specifically craftsman, including 2 subtypes in Hyde Park, the California craftsman and the Southern craftsman. Prairie, Spanish eclectic, colonial revival, and Tudor. The craftsman aesthetic was the most important style of the American bungalow, influenced by the international arts and crafts movement with its dedication to expert craftsmanship. The bungalow achieved the look of being made by hand. The typical craftsman bungalow in Hyde Park is 1 story, sometimes 1.5 stories, has a low-pitched gable roof, wide eave overhangs with exposed rafter tails, decorative braces under gables, columns and pedestals from the roof to the ground, built on piers between 26 inches to 36 inches off the ground, either full or partial front porch, multiple windows, double hung or casement with screens, and awnings to provide shade and allow air circulation. While the craftsman influence came from outside America, the prairie style derived its inspiration from the flat, open land and natural materials of the American Midwest. Less prevalent in Hyde Park, prairie style nonetheless had an important architectural influence on the early bungalow. The most notable prairie-style home in Hyde Park is not a bungalow, but rather a large, expansive home. It, along with many other large homes concentrated in the eastern portion of the district, reflect the prosperity that Tampa enjoyed at the beginning of the 20th century. At the end of World War I, a shift in domestic architecture was evident in the move toward historical or period styles. European-inspired colonial revival, neoclassical, Tudor, and Mediterranean period houses began to appear in Hyde Park. This post-war swing in architectural style also affected the articulation of the bungalow. Now siding, porch columns, brickwork, and roofing began to reflect the period house. The popularity of Mediterranean period architectural style, which includes Spanish eclectic style, was not only seen in the bungalow, but also in 2- and 3-story multifamily units, and the distinctive 10-story Bayshore Royal that anchors the southern border of the historic Hyde Park district. Through the Depression years, deferred maintenance, economic circumstances, and changing lifestyles took a toll on many older homes. Yet Hyde Park continued to be a desirable place to live.
Dad and his brother and 5 or 6 other kids in the neighborhood, and you got to remember this is right in the middle of the Great Depression. Like in 1932, Dad and his friends, there wasn't a lot to do. Nobody had any money. So these kids put together sailboats out of more or less found material. And they built nice little sailing boats, 16, 18 feet long. There was a total of 7 boats in the flotilla at one time. They were known as the Newport Navy. These kids were good kids, but they were teenagers, and the neighborhood kind of referred to them as those bad kids. They always causing trouble, getting, pranksters. So the Newport Navy was docked right down on Bayshore Boulevard at the end of Rome Avenue. They had constructed a wooden plank that went out from the seawall. They'd hop over the seawall and get onto a 2x8 plank that went out on pilings where they had tied a dinghy and used the dinghy to go out to their sailboats.
After the war, Tampa entered an unprecedented period of growth and economic prosperity as servicemen returned with their families to live. Yet well-intended national public policies, such as the GI Bill, encouraged suburban growth rather than reinvestment in older communities such as Hyde Park. From its distinguished early 20th century start, Hyde Park had grown frail and worn by the 1950s. Yet its tree-covered streets, handsome architecture, and pedestrian-friendly sidewalks endured.
The Bayshore, when this house was built, there was no seawall, and the grassy plot was a streetcar track. I took my son when he was a little boy, just a few years old, on the last streetcar ride that went from Franklin out to Ballast Point.
In 1961, the Kennedys moved into the historic White House and were dismayed to find little of historic significance there. Mrs. Kennedy noted that visitors to the White House would find practically nothing inside that dated back before 1948. No sense of history. With the nation looking on, the Kennedys began the historic restoration of the White House and the adjacent neighborhood. On February 14, 1962, Mrs. Kennedy introduced the newly restored White House to a national television audience. Because of her focus on one of the most important and visible buildings in American history, historic preservation found a national stage and took off. By 1966, the National Preservation Act was passed, and Americans began returning to older neighborhoods and investing in modestly priced homes in historic urban areas. In Hyde Park, the renewal began. Hyde Park has experienced steady restoration. One house at a time, one block at a time. And the restorations continue today.
The old house that we have was built in 1917, and it's really become a labor of love for us, and we're finally done with all of the construction now. We replaced windows, we replaced doors, and then there was this unsightly fence, so we had to take that down and build a new one. And I think one of the things that I'm most proud of my house, it reads real well and shows real well from the street, but I really love my cedar fence.
The Banner Awards were started out as an education program of Tampa preservation. There was no ARC, so there were no restrictions on what people could or could not do to their historic homes or buildings. And we wanted to encourage the proper preservation of the structures.
unsympathetic alterations have been removed, and restored bungalows now house young families who have moved into the neighborhood.
Every year, we in Hyde Park invite the rest of the world in to see what we love about our neighborhood and why we love to live here.
Urban life thrives.
The value of historic districts in terms of their property values have increased much more dramatically than older neighborhoods that are not designated as historic districts. So that's a benefit of the district designation.
Commercial and retail development is once again apparent.
When you come in, you tend to know their names. We have a lot of repeat customers here in the Restoration Hardware from Hyde Park, so everyone sort of becomes this tight-knit. We know what their homes look like. We know who their families are.
Hyde Park is important for a number of reasons. One, of course, it's the crown jewel of historic preservation in the city of Tampa. It's known throughout the state and the nation as being a prime example of historic preservation. Because of the continuous examples of architecture throughout the Hyde Park area, one gets a feeling for what the entire area was like.
Parks and open spaces have always been a part of Hyde Park, from Henry B. Plant's lovely gardens to pedestrian-friendly Bayshore Boulevard, from quiet little Burns Park to the expansive, child-friendly Kate Jackson Park. Hyde Park is once again all about people living and working together.
I can't imagine ever moving away from this neighborhood because our family has been here for over 100 years. And I know when I walk out my front door that my father, when he was a young kid, he walked past my house every day on his way to school. My sons went to school here across the street. Everywhere I go in the neighborhood, I can almost feel my family going back. And it's reassuring too, because when I see the old homes and when I see this home, I kind of know that it's been here since 1909 and it's fairly sturdy. It'll probably be here for another 100 years. When times are really uncertain, that's a very comforting feeling to be part of, to feel the past and to feel the future at the same time. It's really strengthening.
As we celebrate the bungalow today, we are reminded of its rich history and of the important impact it has had on the modern, informal, open-plan homes of today. One need look no farther than historic Bungalow Terrace to truly understand the informal, open, and neighborly intent of the bungalow. The preservation of Hyde Park continues to enhance the essential character of the community. Hyde Park today is more than just an address. It's a place to celebrate community, a place to celebrate life, a place to celebrate the bungalow.